Welcome to Awesome Movie Year, the podcast where we take a look back at an awesome year for movies, which is every year. My name is Josh Bell, film critic and writer, and I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm Jason fucking Harris, fucking filmmaker, fucking comedian, and let's do a fucking podcast right fucking now.
All right. Jason earning us that explicit designation right away here.
Like this film, it would have been a PG or PG-13 episode, but got to get those fucks in, baby.
There's plenty of fucks in this film.
In that one scene, that's the only one.
That's what I feel like. Do they never say it elsewhere? Just in that one scene?
I think the whole movie they said would have easily been PG or PG-13 if not for that scene.
Fascinating. Well,
and definitely make it R-rated because someone said fuck. Because
even now that's how it works.
Rough language.
Yes, it is.
Fuck
indeed. In this season of awesome fucking movie year,
yeah, fuck yeah,
we're talking about the films of 1987. And Jason, I feel like for years has been trying to get us to do a Thanksgiving themed episode. Jason loves the holidays. We've done a lot of Halloween related episodes and Christmas related episodes. We haven't done Thanksgiving, in part because there's like virtually no Thanksgiving movies, but this is one of them. It worked out in our schedule. It's holiday time. And so we're talking about Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
I have pushed for Thanksgiving movies on this show, and there are a few other ones out there that I really like. But, if we're going to do one, we might as well do the one that's I'd say this and Charlie Brown are the two most well-known Thanksgiving movies, right?
Well, and that Charlie Brown is like a 30-minute TV special. It's not even really a movie.
Well, Home for the Holidays, Grumpy Old Men, The Ice Storm.
Yeah. I guess. I mean, I feel like, though, even this movie, I mean, it takes place at Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving is kind of key to the plot because the idea is that the characters are trying to get home for Thanksgiving. But we don't ever actually see the Thanksgiving dinner itself or the holiday celebration. The movie ends before that even happens.
Right. But I think it's the camaraderie, and just like at Christmas with what Hughes does for Home Alone, right? It's kind of like the feelings and the vibes and the anticipation of it. I haven't watched Dutch in years, but doesn't Dutch revolve around Thanksgiving? Also another John Hughes written film?
I have not seen that one, actually, so I can't say. But I mean, John Hughes really is so focused on this kind of vision of family and suburbia, even in his teen movies, that it's not surprising that he builds these movies around these kinds of holidays a lot. I
agree. I think, we've talked about John Hughes before, and he's got a very distinct voice, and he's able to, in this one, capture a lot of what he does best, which is building characters, building comedy, and keeping that heart throughout. I think I told you this, Josh, like when I had a hot minute in Hollywood and one of my scripts was going around, a lot of people were like, it's funny, but it has heart, like John Hughes. And I'm like a John Hughes movie. And I'm like, that's just a great compliment. But can you buy it like you would a John Hughes movie? So.
Yeah, I mean, he does always offer that combination, which to me is not always 100% successful. But I feel like in this movie, it mostly does work. Steve Martin and John Candy are the stars of this film as the two very different businessmen trying to get themselves from New York to Chicago at the height of Thanksgiving travel and weather problems and various other problems, taking all these different modes of transportation. At this time, John Hughes was really just known for those teen movies. I mean, we did an episode on 16 Candles, and he had written and or directed so many of these teen hits. So this was a departure for him, getting that R rating, Jason, as you're talking about, but also a story with no teens in it, really, and just adults.
Well, yes, but that's as a director. As a writer, we know he wrote the National Lampoon movies, which do have teens, but really is revolving around the family dynamic.
Yeah.
So, yes, this is kind of that next wave of where Hughes might have been going, but sadly, we don't know because he wrote more, directed just a little more, and then died at the age of 59 before we could see what else he was going to do.
Right. I mean, although he had essentially retired long before that, so who knows what he would or wouldn't have done.
Well, right. That's true. But there was no streaming when he was alive. And you could see, like, something like that where he could just write even like a family show or something like that. You could see that like streaming would definitely be up the alley of John Hughes, I feel like.
Yeah, it could have been. And I think this is one of those movies where it does offer a glimpse into the kind of things that he maybe would have or could have done later in his career if he'd had the opportunity. This movie was a big success. I mean, his teen movies had generally been successful, and this movie did very well also, grossing $49.5 million on its budget of $15 million. And also generally well regarded by critics. It got 2 thumbs up from Siskel and Ebert. And amusingly, in our last episode on Widnell and I mentioned that Siskel compared the central relationship in that film to the Siskel and Ebert relationship. And I was sort of surprised that they didn't say the same thing in this movie, because you can imagine Siskel and Ebert on a road trip being like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
Right. And in that last episode, I feel like I said that both of them would have been the Marwood character. In this episode, I feel like both of them would have been more like Neil Page, the Steve Martin character. I don't see either of them as Dell selling shower curtain rings and singing the Flintstones on bus rides with 100 other people.
Yeah, probably not. Probably not. But they did both.
I want to ask a question before we do that, because we talk, this, like you're talking about what a hit this is, and now like it's become, a tradition for so many people to watch this around Thanksgiving. Do you guys have a movie that you watch, whether it's this or something around Halloween or Christmas, that you watch every year?
I don't really, because I mean, as I'm sure I've said, that other than when it comes up like for this podcast or for articles that I write, I am not a person really who watches movies again. So if it's a Halloween or Christmas, I might want to watch a new holiday themed movie, but I don't really have something like that.
Yeah, I don't really either, for the same reason, but I feel like if like there's any movie I've watched the most times on the same calendar day of a year, it's probably Home Alone.
Another John Hughes movie right there. So yeah, I think for me, it's not every year, but it's maybe every other year or every third year. And it's this one, Home Alone, Die Hard. Those are probably the 3, and on those Charlie Brown specials.
Yeah. And 2 of those movies, John Hughes movies, as you're saying. So, I mean, he definitely captures that feeling of the holiday season.
And when I was reading about John Hughes' unrealized projects, if I'm not mistaken, I think he at one point had the rights for a live action Peanuts movie.
Yeah, I wonder how that would have worked out. I'm still skeptical of the whole idea. Like, I don't know how you can make that work in live action, but if you could, maybe he was the one to do it.
That's from the Christmas. Never mind.
All right. So Roger Ebert, in his review, said, "The letters in the title of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles roar across the screen like a streamliner, and the movie itself has the same confidence. The movie's a terrific comedy, but it's more than that, because eventually Hughes gives the Martin and Candy characters some genuine depth. We begin to understand the dynamics of their relationship, and to see that although they may be opposites, they have more in common than they know. This is a funny movie, but also a surprisingly warm and sweet one."
I don't know why it's surprising that it's warm and sweet. This is John Hughes, right?
Right. I guess maybe it's more from the setup and from the way that those characters interact that you expect it's going to be more of this just like combative comedy. And it is that, but it's less of that than you might imagine.
Yeah, Hughes is such an expert of molding scripts. Like Dell has already annoyed Neil before they even meet, right? By stealing the cab. And, we see that trunk of his, so we get to know the character, and then all the stuff with them finally in the airport and on the airplane. So, I mean, it starts off in that way where they're digging themselves out of that hole, which is classic buddy comedy, road trip comedy stuff. And Hughes really delivers there. I know both, it's said that both Martin and Candy both say this is their favorite movie of theirs.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, it's a great showcase for both of them, both like in comedy and in that genuine emotion.
Yeah.
And I mean, one thing I appreciated is that you expect in a movie like this, they're going to butt heads. And then, of course, even if it's not that emotional, eventually, of course, they're going to become friends and acknowledge that they like each other and so on. And I liked that it kind of comes to a head, even though it happens multiple times. But there's this big confrontation that's like early in the movie when Steve Martin gives this big speech about how annoying Dell is. And it's a very good scene because you can see John Candy plays it really well, where they show on his face and he's just like sad. He's hearing all this stuff about himself, and that like some of it is true, and he knows that it's true, and it's just making him sad that this person that he was trying to become friends with just finds him so annoying. And then Neil also realizes eventually like he's gone too far and he's been too harsh, and they kind of make up. And that's in like the first third of the movie, and they still have conflicts, but I feel like it establishes early on that like, yeah, they're going to be friends, and we're not going to pretend that they're not.
Yeah, there's definitely an ebb and flow to this over and over again. And, Josh, you kind of touched on a point that I wanted to bring up, which is I think one of the reasons the movie works so well is because they're playing the truth of the scenes and not the joke of the scenes. And that's why the jokes work so well, because they're playing the honesty of them.
Right, right.
And I just wanted to add, because you mentioned the sadness of John Candy, right? Like, he's really good at like getting you to empathize with him.
Right. And I think that's important because Dell is annoying. And I mean, he's meant to be, but you also understand kind of where that comes from. So Richard Schickel in Time Magazine also talked about that kind of mix of sentiment. He said, "It is, of course, always a pleasure to watch Martin's steam gauge face register his rising internal pressures and to witness his exquisitely expressed blow-offs. But Candy offers even more insinuating delights. Covering lonely need with empty gab, insecurity with a not entirely trustworthy savvy, he is the most dangerous kind of pest, the type who worms rather than blusters his way into your life. The movie works the same way. For all its broadly farcical air, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles finally seals its bond with the audience in the same way that Martin and Candy seal theirs, with a sly, shy resort to sentiment. Maybe that's just the spirit of the season, but one does not mind indulging it."
Right. You never know, but you could see, the way that Steve Martin and Martin Short work together. I mean, you could easily see these two having reteamed had John Candy lived longer and creating more comedy magic together.
Right. And I mean, I think this movie is so beloved that if Candy had lived longer, people would have been clamoring for, when is the next Steve Martin, John Candy team up going to happen?
I'm glad you didn't say a sequel.
Well, that too. But I mean, certainly just in general, just putting them together in any way, whether it's a sequel or in something else.
There were remakes in development with Will Smith and Kevin Hart, and then Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler. And please don't do either of them.
Yeah, no, that would not. Because I feel like also what's good about this movie is not necessarily the premise being so unique that we need to redo it. It's the way that Hughes approaches it and the way that the Steve Martin and John Candy act it. Just the idea of what happens in the movie is not all that amazing or original.
Right. It's a road trip movie, a mismatched buddy comedy, whatever you want to call it. And Hughes said, he wrote this first draft in 3 days, which is what John Hughes does, right? Writes a draft in less than a week and then tinkers with it for, 20 more drafts. And then the original cut of this was 3 hours and 45 minutes because, plot changes, improvs, just kind of scenes built into scenes, just letting these guys work. And it's pretty amazing that he was able to get such a coherent piece down to about 90 minutes with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that doesn't really work and that it made more sense to me when I read about the cuts is apparently there was a subplot about Neil's wife not believing that he's really stuck in places and thinking that he's actually like fooling around on her. And I felt like their relationship was not really very well established. And there are these cuts back to her periodically, like kind of sitting at home and fretting or whatever, but just in very brief moments. And especially at the end when they reunite and she's like hugging him and like shedding a tear. And I'm like, they've been away from each other for like 3 days. And I didn't really feel the emotion of that. And it seems like, that came from the idea of her realizing like, oh no, he's not cheating on me. He really was hanging out with this weird guy. And the missing subplot there kind of muddles that.
There was another subplot that I think would have kind of even pushed this further when they're in that motel and the guy comes in to rob them. Originally, that was the pizza delivery guy. John Candy, Dell only tips him like $1 or $2. So the guy comes back later to take the money that he feels he's owed, which I think would have heightened, this whole kind of annoyance factor. Not that they would have known who stole it, but just kind of from an audience standpoint of why that happened. Not to say that a random burglary couldn't take place.
Right. That is a sort of a weird scene where all of a sudden this random guy sneaks in their room and takes the money out of their wallets while they're sleeping, and which I feel like is not a typical hotel robbery mode or whatever, but maybe it is. But I mean, it really just is to facilitate the plot so that they're out of cash and it's another obstacle for them to overcome.
And this is one of those movies where like me and you just nitpick two things, but it really doesn't matter, right? It's about those two guys and their relationship, and we go along for the ride no matter what the mode of transportation with them.
Indeed. Mm-hmm. So finally, critic-wise, Janet Maslin in the New York Times was not a fan, and she had a strange kind of comparison here to the John Hughes teen movies. She said, Mr. Hughes conceives of this film's adult characters as lost adolescents and seems to regard their mature status as a terrible burden that they will, with luck, be able to shed. The real trouble with Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is simpler. There wasn't much of an idea here to begin with. And when Mr. Hughes works with non-teenage characters, he has smaller reserves of colloquial humor upon which to draw. It's harder to have one man complain that traveling with the other is, quote, like going on a date with a chatty Cathy doll than it would be to have a teenager deliver that line. None of Mr. Hughes's earlier films have revolved around anything more complicated than prom dates and parent troubles and getting along with schoolmates. But they had a texture and authenticity that Planes, Trains, and Automobiles lacks.
Yeah, don't agree with that one. Pretty much the whole way through. I didn't feel like they were in Arrested Development. These are characters who have led full lives. They're both professionals. They both have various family situations. I didn't get any of that. And I felt like each of their motivations in pretty much every scene was clear.
Yeah, and I also feel like whether you like John Hughes's teen movies or not, that she's mischaracterizing them when she says they're just about these superficial teen things. Like we're saying, he's always trying to do something more and have some seriousness and character depth and say something about family life and suburbia and whatever. And you can argue that it doesn't work or that you don't like it, but it's definitely there.
I think that's why people still love those movies as opposed to other teen movies, right? Because there are plenty of funny teen movies, but there aren't ones with emotional depth like you're talking about, where I think, especially in The Breakfast Club, you get that.
Yeah, I mean, revisiting some John Hughes stuff, I have found myself not as enamored necessarily as I was as a teen with all of these films, but I think you're right. And again, I think even if you're not a fan, you can't say that he's not aiming for that or that he doesn't add that kind of thing into the movie beyond just silly teenage antics.
This is better than Drill Bit Taylor, probably, if that's what you were making John Hughes comparisons.
I wasn't, although I have seen Drill Bit Taylor in the theater. I reviewed that when that
he wrote that, I think, right?
He did. Yeah. I think that's his final credit, actually. Under a pseudonym, as he used in a lot of his later films, but he did write it. So, Jason, I mean, I know this is a beloved movie for you, so I assume you've seen this multiple times.
Never seen it still to this day. No, I've seen it. I couldn't tell you the first time I saw it. I really don't know. I remember revisiting it a few years ago, and I was just like, I need to watch a Thanksgiving movie, but I don't know. I can't think that would have been the first time I saw it, but maybe it was. Who's to say, Josh? But I've seen it probably at least 3 times, and honestly, like we watched it, this week for the podcast, but. If Scarlett wants to watch a Thanksgiving movie, I think I would show this to her, like within this year. Like, I'm happy to watch this again right now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I did not see this, and this is another one of these that I think, we've talked about this a lot this season, that people watched this movie when they were kids. And even though it's R-rated, I mean, other than the swear word, like you said, it's really not like so inappropriate for children. And probably had that love for it as a child, and that's not something I have. So I don't have that nostalgia for it. I watched it, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so for the first time. I think just because it was a thing to catch up on that is beloved. And I thought it was fine. And I kind of feel that way now too. Like I said, I feel like when I've revisited a lot John Hughes stuff for the most part, it doesn't have the same resonance for me that it did maybe when I was a kid. And, this one I might have enjoyed more if it had been like a family holiday staple for my family, but we were watching Christmas Story instead.
During Thanksgiving time, you were already watching Christmas movies.
Why not? Yeah. I feel like honestly, you're joking there, but I feel like that's one of the reasons why there aren't a lot of Thanksgiving movies, because by Thanksgiving, you start Christmas. Like, what is the end of the Macy's Thanksgiving parade? It's Santa Claus shows up. And once you eat your Thanksgiving dinner, you're ready to watch a Christmas
or go out to Black Friday and buy your Christmas presents. And I get it, because even watching this now, we're recording in October, and I'm like, I shouldn't be watching this till November. It's still Halloween movie season, right?
Right. So, Dave, did you watch this one as a kid?
I'm sure I did, but it's been at least 20 plus years since the last time I saw it. And yeah, I mean, I loved all these movies of this, kind back then, but it's been so long.
And Dave, I feel like, we bust your mom's chops for showing you a lot of movies that aren't appropriate for kids, but I feel like this one would have been, and this seems like the type of movie that she would have watched with you.
Yeah, she probably recited the fuck line over and over again. So that seems like something she'd do.
Yeah. So anything else about the background of this film you want to mention, Jason?
I mean, staples, right? From John Hughes, Chicago based, right? Things like that. Just there are a lot of Easter eggs here for John Hughes fans. Supposedly, when they're on the highway, they pass the Griswolds and just little things like that. So you watch it, you figure it out, Josh.
Yeah, they don't live in Shermer, Illinois, even though clearly Neil lives in a suburb of some kind. But that's, where a lot of these John Hughes movies take place, in that fictional town. But it is Chicago area.
And this I found odd. They built the house that the Pages live in from scratch, and it cost $100,000 to build. And you barely see that house there. Like, I don't know why you couldn't have just used a real house for that.
Yeah, the set. They didn't build an actual house.
No, they did. That's what I'm telling you.
Like a full, including the exterior?
Nah, I don't know. Maybe it was a set. Leave me alone. Let's go back.
I assume it was a set.
Fine.
I mean, I can see it costing $100,000 to build a set. But,
yeah. Well, why not just shoot it in a real house is what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because Hughes has this very specific idea. I mean, you mentioned the 3-hour, 45-minute cut. For all we know, there's 30, 40 minutes of scenes inside the house that got cut. But that, maybe Hughes thought were important at the time, and that's why they needed to build that set.
And I don't know about a 3-hour and 45-minute cut, but if you were like, hey, there's a 2.5, 3-hour cut, I'd probably watch it.
I would rather not, but thankfully I didn't have to. So we'll come back and talk some more of our general thoughts on Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this special Thanksgiving episode of our season on the films of 1987, we're talking about John Hughes's Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And Jason, you're a big fan of this film, right? So, what's your favorite thing about it?
Is it the planes? Is it the trains? And I do like that he calls it automobiles, because we do get a bus in there. So you can't get him on the technicality, right? So
right. I feel like it's the cadence of it too. Planes, trains, and cars doesn't sound right.
Yeah, I was going to ask Dave if he watched, I think there's a Hallmark movie from last year called Planes, Trains, and Christmas Trees. Have you ever seen that, Dave?
I haven't, no. But this seems like ripe for that kind of thing.
Ugh, gross.
Yeah, I mean, you could see a version of this where Neil and Del fall in love, right?
Ooh, erotic.
That sounds fun.
Josh, the best thing about this is the chemistry between the two leads. And so to say like, oh, what's the best thing? It's tough to say, because whenever those two are on screen together, like, it's great. And then there are times, I do think it worked out well the times he separated them, as I referenced the famous Edie McClurg scene where Steve Martin goes nuts and he gets his comeuppance there. Really famous stuff that works on its own because of the building blocks to get there. So I think the motivations and the kind of reactions that you get all work. To me, probably the most memorable scene is John Candy doing the mess around in the car, which, that's another Hughes staple. And I know you watched Uncle Buck and weren't a fan because you're a sad, sad man. But, there's that scene in there where they're kind of lip syncing to a different song. And I think John Candy just doing the mess around and messing around with the car, getting it to catch on fire is probably the most rewatchable scene in this film. And also the Steve Martin fuck scene.
Yes, and that is certainly a John Hughes staple. I think of like what is it? Is it Twist and Shout in Ferris Bueller's Day Off?
Yeah, there's a lot of the that stuff.
Yeah, and I did watch Uncle Buck on your recommendation, and I did not care for it, but I like this more than Uncle Buck, definitely. And I feel like it is the relationship. And one of the things I didn't like about Uncle Buck was that I didn't buy into the relationships, especially like the sort of central similar thing, the bond of characters who don't like each other at first and then come around to care about each other. I didn't buy at all in that film. And here I did. And I think one of the things I like about it is like what I was referencing before, where it's not just this linear, like they don't like each other, and then they realize that they do like each other, is that, they're antagonistic and they have that big blow up in the hotel room fairly early in the film. And you see Neil realize like, oh, I was too hard on this guy and I shouldn't have been that mean to him or whatever. And you think, yeah, they actually like each other, and they do actually like each other. But at the same time, Neil is still kind of trying to get away from him, because I like the idea that it's not just someone is annoying and you don't like them. Sometimes there are people who are annoying and you do like them, but they're still annoying and you still kind of want to get away from them sometimes if you spend 3 days with them. And I like that dynamic.
Yeah, he's trying to get home for Thanksgiving and he's dealt with so much crap, all of which Del is there for. So he might, like you said, be a big fan of him, but he might just need to be away from everybody for a while, right? At the same time, when at the diner, he says he's going to go out and just try to get there on his own. I think Candy really plays that well of how hurt he is without trying to show how hurt he is, And,
Right.
and you keep bringing up this kind of idea, which I think is good, of like they have the blow up, they make up, and there's at least two other, like I just gave that other instance of him trying to get away. And then there's the one after he burns out the car where Neil gets the motel room and Del is in the burnt out car, just talking to Marie, telling her that he blew it again. And, finally found someone he likes and can hang out with. And what does he do but screw it up? And then, that is a great sequence because you get that. And then Neil invites him in, and there's that great scene with the two actually bonding and enjoying each other's company in the hotel room, which is nice because you would think like, the classic studio note, conflict. There's no conflict in that scene. And they just get along really, really well. And it's a great reprieve from what you've seen. You kind of need that breather to see that there is a real bond between these two.
Yeah, and I also like that scene, right before that, where you're saying where he's in the car and he's kind of talking to his dead wife, and you get the sense of self-awareness from him when he's like, he knows that he has a tendency to push it too far and try too hard because he's lonely and he wants to make friends. And, part of the reason why the sadness feels genuine, like in that earlier scene with the blow up, is because that Del realizes that there's some truth to what Neil is saying about him. And he's sad because people see that in him and he can't help it. So, it adds depth to this very basic dynamic.
The Del character is such a people pleaser, right? And he kind of needs those relationships. And in the end, when they reveal, that Maria's been dead for 8 years and he hasn't been home in all that time, you do get the full kind of scope of just how sad he is and why he's always out on the road and pushing through. And seems like every time he's dealing with, a motel owner or just talking to random people trying to sell them the shower rings, whether they're earrings or not, right? That's when he is able to kind of block out the pain that he's still dealing with, right? So, yeah, I mean, those emotional depths really make this thing cook.
Yeah, I mean, I like that sequence too, where he sells all these people the shower curtain rings as other things, as earrings or even various different things because they're desperate for money and he's got to do what he can. And it shows you that right? He's actually really good at his job. He's a really good salesman. He seems like this kind of goofy guy, but when it comes down to it, he can sell the stuff that, and what he's selling, like shower curtain rings. Come on, that's a ridiculous, it's like a very, what kind of silly thing can we come up with for our comedy character to be selling? But he's really good at his job. And all the people, when he says, oh, I'm going to call my friend at this airline, or my buddy is the manager of this motel. And those people really are, they like him. They're happy to see him. And so he's not just a buffoon. You get the sense that he's actually really good at what he does.
I think there are, like I said, all those nice little Easter eggs. Like at the diner, there's a group of girls behind them, and they're wearing the shower curtain rings as earrings, the little, kind of bells and whistles there. It's interesting to watch now because it is sad knowing what happened to John Candy and John Hughes. And you just think of like all the great content that they could have kept doing, right?
Content. That's what we want from them.
Movies, TV. I mean, you could see John Candy just kind of, he could have owned an HBO show, right?
Right. You just look at what Steve Martin's career was after this and see how John Candy's career could have followed a similar path. And yeah, watching Uncle Buck with this made me sort of less enamored of John Candy and thinking like, it's tragic that he died young, but maybe part of that has mythologized his talent or whatever. But he is very good in this film. And Steve Martin too, who I've always liked, and they play off each other really well. And I think that's a big part of it because, I'm saying a lot of positive things, but like a lot of the comedy for me in this movie doesn't really do much for me. I'm really not a fan of the like kind of cringe comedy that comes out of awkward situations or people's misunderstandings or whatever. And, including in things that people really love, it's just not for me at all. And so I don't laugh a lot watching this movie, but I did find it pleasant for the most part. And so that's kind of how I feel. And a big part of that is just those two performances that are enjoyable to watch.
Other than the scene where they're waking up in the same bed and kind of snuggling, and John Neil says, where are your hands? And where's your other hand? He says, between two pillows, and the famous line, those aren't pillows, right? And then they play like, hey, we're big straight macho guys, right? What other cringe comedy moments were you referring to?
I feel like everything in that hotel room, not just the scene where they wake up, but the entire sequence of them in the hotel room, before they go to bed.
Socks in the sink and stuff.
Yeah, like all that stuff. And, and even that big speech, which I mentioned as a positive in terms of the storytelling, like I don't really enjoy as comedy per se. So yeah, to me, it's just kind of uncomfortable. And that's just me. I can't stand stuff like Curb Your Enthusiasm or The Office that are beloved and people love. And I hate that stuff.
Yeah. And I love that stuff. So
right.
That scene that you're talking about, the thing that makes that scene, Josh, is Dell's reaction. Neil gives that, eviscerating speech, and Steve Martin pulls it off, obviously, because he's a comic genius, right? But John Candy, when he, was looking at him with that sadness, and he says, you don't like me, that's fine. I like me. My wife likes me. And it's like really this kind of like, he's self-validating while he's saying it. And you could see that kind of, like I said, sadness is the word there. That's what makes that scene tick, I think.
Right. Oh, and I completely agree with you on that, because otherwise it's just this over the top rant, which Martin does very well. But yeah, and I think that shows, like I said, that self-awareness of Dell knowing that like he's the kind of person that people can find abrasive. And I like that, because to me, I feel like that's, I don't know if you know people like that, because I feel like that's a dynamic or a kind of person that's not shown as much in movies, where it's like, there's nothing wrong with this person. Like they're not mean. They're not like stupid. They're not, they're not doing bad things or whatever, but they're just really annoying and I can't stand to be around them, and they haven't wronged me in any way. I just don't want to ever talk to them or be near them.
Are you hoping that they do wrong you so you have an excuse to not be by them anymore?
In a way, maybe, right? And I feel like Dell is that kind of person. And for me, even as a viewer, I was like, no, Dell, like I would not want to spend any time with Dell. Dell is really annoying and remains annoying throughout the film, even as they become friends. And I like that they become friends. But as a person, I would be like, get the fucking guy away from me.
It's interesting because I think most people probably, like I said, empathize with him and consider the Neil character like, hey, you're being a dick here, right? So, but Josh, of course, you empathize with the dick.
I did empathize with Neil because I mean, look at, they're both, dicked around by circumstance, right? By airlines and bus companies and car rental companies and all this stuff. And like, I don't know, I sympathize with that. If that was me, I would be really upset.
That would be rough. I agree with you. Dave, where do you fall on this, Neil or Del?
Probably Neil's side, but
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah. It's tough though, because I mean, it's so sweet the way that they do enjoy each other's company, even though he is so annoying.
Yeah, there's that kind of song that they play over and over in the background, Dave, and I feel like that, I like when movies do that, where they have one piece that kind of keeps the train chugging along here.
Yeah.
And I feel like that really worked in this movie.
Yeah, no, that is cool when a movie does that. I'm trying to think of other examples. Like, I know I've heard that before, where it's like that same song. Well, I guess Groundhog Day, right?
The Graduate, Mrs. Robinson, right?
Sure.
Things like
that.
Yeah. Josh, another thing that I think we got to talk about with Hughes is like he really crafts these like one scene characters for the most part. Like they're the rocket boosters, right? Like the Edie McClurg, and they all have their say, maybe other than the Michael McKean character, right? But he's able to elevate the comedy with like the Dylan Bakers and the stuff like that, and he in all of his movies, he's always able to find great supporting roles for people.
Yeah, and especially this kind of film where it's this road trip, so they're really not, I mean, they're encountering people and then they leave them behind, and so they're all at least one scene characters. Kevin Bacon in his like wordless cameo as the guy in New York who steals the cab, or Larry Hankin as the weird cab driver in Wichita with his, what is his name? Like Doobie. Yeah. Doobie, the cab driver. Like, where did he come from? How did they end up in his cab or whatever? That's all blinged out and everything. But it's amusing. I mean, Dylan Baker playing the kind of character you do not expect from like current Dylan Baker at all, as that weird hillbilly character who picks them up in his pickup truck.
Yeah, that's I think Dylan Baker's first movie role. The interesting Kevin Bacon and Larry Hankin, obviously, they're both in She's Having a Baby. And even though this came out before She's Having a Baby, when Neil's wife is when they're on the phone and Neil's wife is watching TV, she's watching a scene from She's Having a Baby.
Huh. So did they shoot that movie before this, but then it came out afterwards?
I think they maybe shot it afterwards and he put it in post.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It's a little self-referential thing.
Well, that's what I mean. He does a lot of that stuff, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. I wanted to go back to the music though, Jason, because I mean, some of the songs like that mess around scene that you're talking about are good, but the score for this movie is awful. And
taking it to Ira Newborn.
It really is. And it also, there's this like motif where it's like, it's got this kind of like record scratchy thing going on. And it's just, it really feels like some composer in 1987, like, what are the cool hip kids like in their music these days? What about that hippity hoppity music? Let's get some record scratches in here. And it sounds so dated and it's so annoying and it's like loud and abrasive. And I just really didn't like it.
Interesting, because Hughes, as we know, was kind of such a big proponent of like new wave and like really cool like post-punk stuff in the 80s. And I think we get Dave Wakeling in here, or maybe that's She's Having a Baby. I'm running them together. But yeah, that is interesting, because I think, you think of Pretty in Pink or something, and the music is so essential, even though that's one he wrote and didn't direct. So yeah, sure.
There's like a remix in the credits too, where like sound clips from Del.
Yeah, that's
Del Griffin.
Yeah, that's 80s. That's 80s horrific. I agree.
Yeah, that's the thing I was gonna say, is that like the score didn't bother me per se, like it bothered Josh, but like it is extremely dated sounding.
And I feel like there's some dated stuff like synthy soundtracks from like or stuff from like Vangelis or Goblin in like Giallo movies or whatever. Tangerine Dream. Yeah, exactly. All that stuff I really like. And it is super dated, but in a good way. And I feel like this was just in a really unpleasant.
Yeah, sometimes like, I watched Thief for the first time this year, the Michael Mann movie, and like that's Tangerine Dream at their best. And I'm like, that sounds like that could come out today and it would still be fresh, right? So, it's a fine line to walk there on this. But maybe that helps add to how effective it is when, he does something like the mess around.
Yeah, I mean, I just, the contrast is fine. I just wish that the score itself wasn't so annoying.
That mess around scene looked like it would just be so much fun to shoot, to watch, to perform in. That would have been an easy one for John Candy to go overboard with, but I think he goes to the right amount of, like, you could see a guy doing this in the car in a crazy, haggard state, but he's not, again, he's playing it in a grounded way.
Right. What do you think about the weird moment where they're about to crash when they're driving on the wrong side of the road and they suddenly see like weird surreal versions of each other?
I'm glad that you brought that up because I marked that down too, because it is out of place here, right? And we've seen that in other Hughes movies. And she's having a baby. There's tons of stuff like that. So, but I didn't think it fit in this one. I guess you could say, the idea of like, we're about to die. So is it life flashing before our eyes or just some strange moment? You could get away with it, but yeah, that was, that's a little out of sync there.
Yeah, it's weird. And I noted it again. I mean, it's jarring to see in the movie itself. And then I noted it again because I was watching the Siskel and Ebert segment, and they use that as one of the clips that they show in the segment. But that surreal bit is cut for some reason. And Siskel complains. He's like, why did the studio send us this clip and they leave it out? And this is what's in the movie. And they're really doing a disservice to their own movie by leaving this out. And he thought that this was like an essential element of the scene.
Maybe it is. Maybe we're the ones who are missing things.
I don't know. I mean, it's so brief that it didn't necessarily bother me, but it does feel very like jarring where all of a sudden you're like, what is this? What is happening here? Because there's nothing like that. I mean, I haven't seen She's Having a Baby, but it sounds like, if that's a pervasive thing with these surreal bits or fantasy bits, that's one thing, but it never happens either prior to or following that one scene.
I agree with you. It's out of sync.
Yeah.
It totally doesn't make sense to me. Another thing that doesn't make sense, I wanted to touch on this in the music, Josh. It ends with a cover of Every Time You Go, right? The Paul Young song, Every Time You Go. That song, Josh. That's the one.
Yeah. No, I know. I
can keep singing it if you're not sure what song I'm referring to.
Please don't.
But it's so strange to me because Paul Young approved his version. John Hughes wanted it. And then the music studio, whoever was, his publishing house wouldn't approve this version of the song being in the John Hughes movie. And it's so strange because it's like, John Hughes has a track record. The artist wants it in there. Like, this can only be good for everybody. Why wouldn't they give him the rights to this song? I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't know. And like you said, it's not like John Hughes is an unknown quantity. And part of what he's known for in all those teen movies is really showcasing that like new wave music. So who knows? But I feel like there's short-sighted examples of things like that in so many different films where some song could have been in it or a different version. And sometimes what happens is because of that short-sightedness, like some other song is in it and becomes a huge hit and is indelibly associated with the film. And that's not really the case here, but I feel like that has happened in other places.
Yeah. Josh, how about some alternative casting?
All right, let's hear it.
All right. So for Neil, it was Tom Hanks and Rick Moranis. I think both of them would have been really good. And I also think Rick Moranis could have played Del really well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah.
And then for Del, John Travolta, that's a no.
Oof, yeah.
John Goodman, that's a yes.
Yeah.
Dudley Moore, maybe?
Yeah, I don't know about that.
Bill Murray's a yes. And then Robin Williams, I'm going maybe.
Yeah, I mean, Candy really does because he has, as we keep saying, that mix of the like sadness and the comedy. And I feel like that's not something that everyone can really pull off. And I think Steve Martin, as much as like someone like Tom Hanks could have been good in that role, I think what's great there is that Steve Martin, he's not just like an everyman kind of, which is what we think of for Tom Hanks, but he does have that kind of cynical edge to him. And that really works. And that's something that Steve Martin has.
I think that works, but he's not like a jerk. I mean, no pun intended for a Steve Martin movie, right?
Right.
But he, dude, anybody who goes through something like this on any trip, especially trying to get home for a family holiday, I would be so frazzled dealing with this stuff.
Right. And that was what I was kind of saying earlier. But yeah, you're right. We see him in the beginning and he's in this like corporate boardroom. And, this is kind of shorthand for like, oh, this is some sort of, uptight suit wearing dickhead or whatever. And he's not. I mean, yeah, he works this corporate job, but that's not just who the character is. And just like Del, he has nuances beyond the stereotype of what we think of for a character like that.
Yeah. Josh, I was thinking about what you were saying earlier about how to place that kind of surreal moment is. There is one other example of that when they're in the Wichita airport and all the flights get canceled and when it goes on the destination board, it just flips to nowhere.
Yeah. And that's a very like small background detail that you have to look for. If you don't, you could easily miss. But I feel like that other moment with the devil and the skeleton or whatever, like it's unmissable.
That is true.
So should we rate this out of 5 planes, trains, and or automobiles?
There you go. 5 vehicles or modes of transportation.
Yeah.
It gets 4 from me. It has always remained at 4, and that's where it will stay.
I give it 3. One each of a plane, a train, and an automobile, I guess. It's I can see why it's beloved. I don't love it, but there's a lot here to appreciate. So that's kind of how it lands for me. Dave, how would you rate this?
I'm going 3.5, right in the middle. Maybe that's a bicycle or something.
Yeah. I'm surprised they don't end up on that or like a tricycle, right? They'd have to go the last little bit of the trip in the
double decker bicycle, or, a 2-seater, right? Or something.
A tandem. Yeah, exactly. Missed opportunity. That'll be in the
double decker. That'd be a strange bicycle.
Yeah. I don't know how that would work. I don't think that's possible.
We're going to build it now.
Yeah. We'll come back in a moment and talk about the legacy of planes, trains, and automobiles. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year in this special Thanksgiving episode of our season on the films of 1987. We're talking about John Hughes's Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And we've talked about John Hughes and his legacy a couple times already. We did an episode on 16 Candles, as well as on National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, which he wrote but did not direct. And, as we're talking about earlier, he sadly died at a young age. And even before that, though, he had basically retired. He directed a few more movies after this. She's Having a Baby that you were talking about, and Uncle Buck that I watched, and then Curly Sue, and then kind of became almost like this recluse and wrote scripts and sort of sent them out, but didn't really have his association with them.
And you wonder what would have happened. Like I said earlier, I still think that there would have been Amazon could have backed up the money truck and said, just make a high school series and wherever you want in Chicago or whatever he was into. He was such a powerful force in Hollywood. I mean, you look at just the movies he wrote and how quickly he turned stuff around. Like there was if he wanted to retire and just be retired, he could have done that, obviously. But I think that there would have been some type of John Hughes renaissance for this.
Yeah, I mean, and the way that his work has become even more beloved and influential. I mean, even since he died, he lived until 2009, so he certainly would have seen a lot of that resurgence in his lifetime. But even since then, I feel like it's been even more of that, and especially in this era where anything that's like recognizable or well known is these studios and streamers are desperate for it. To be able to put John Hughes's name on something, absolutely somebody would have been desperate for
it's just crazy because Dave said he watches Home Alone every year, right, or close to it, right? And we think of this and those teen movies, like it's just amazing. And the vacation movies, right? How many iconic things that he put together. And then you're like, oh, okay, he also wrote like stuff like Beethoven, right? And it's like Beethoven, whatever. But then you're like, oh, there were 5 Beethoven movies, right? Like,
right.
He was a hit machine. I've seen every movie he's directed, Josh. I can rank them.
Okay. I have not. And although I did watch Uncle Buck again, or not again for the first time, and I'd rank that low, I think.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's about 4. It goes, do you want the rankings, Josh? So,
I mean, you clearly want to give them, so let's hear them.
okay, 7-1 or 1-7.
Whatever you want.
Best is Ferris Bueller, I'd say. Ferris Bueller's Day
Yeah,
Off.
that's my favorite too. Although I'm like wary of revisiting it now because I've had very mixed reactions to his films as an adult.
Yeah, I watched it a few years ago. It still holds up to me. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is number 2. I think Breakfast Club is number 3, the quintessential teen angst film, right? I have Uncle Buck at number 4. Then I have 16 Candles at number 5. Number 6, Weird Science. I don't like that one, a little too wacky. And then
Yeah.
Curly Sue, just not my favorite. That's after that. And actually, I got to put She's Having a Baby and then Curly Sue.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't seen She's Having a Baby or Curly Sue, and it doesn't seem like I really need to see those.
You have to, Josh. You have to watch all of those.
No, it's probably not
I
going
mean, She's Having a Baby has some really good stuff in it, but I think that the issue is like those tonal shifts, which we're kind of talking about here. They really don't work for that movie at all, especially in the third act. It gets very serious, and you're like, this was just very farcical. What happened here?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like maybe another thing that could have happened if he had, stuck around is that maybe he could have ended up writing or directing some, straight dramas at some point because he was moving toward that territory, and that never ended up happening.
Yeah, I think you're right, Josh.
So, as we said, John Candy sadly also died very young, even younger, in 1994 at age 43. But I mean, was a huge comedy powerhouse in the 80s and early 90s. And I mean, even though revisiting some of this stuff now or seeing it for the first time, I was less enamored of him. I remember, like, as a kid, I was a huge John Candy fan, including some lesser known John Candy films that I probably would not enjoy now. Stuff like Only the Lonely, speaking of, Chris Columbus, who we talked about earlier this season, or Delirious and Who's Harry Crumb. And I feel like I watched all those movies as a kid and liked them. And they're probably not good movies.
I'd like to see them, a few of those again. John Hughes wrote Only the Lonely, or he produced it. Yeah, he produced Only the Lonely. I think, we talked about John Candy a little on our Blues Brothers episodes. He's got 2 Emmys for writing for SCTV Network 90, but Camp Candy was great when we were growing up too, his cartoon show.
Yeah, I don't know if I watched that, but I did love the movies for whatever reason. The Great Outdoors, which I think is a John Hughes screenplay with John Candy and is it Dan Aykroyd or Chevy Chase who's in that one?
Yeah, and it's Dan Aykroyd, but that's that class of like the 80s. I read that book Wild and Crazy Guys about all those 80s leading comedy men, and Martin and Candy were both in Little Shop of Horrors. I'd say Canadian Bacon, that's with Rick Moranis also. That's a great underrated John Candy movie.
Yeah, that's Michael Moore's only narrative film, and that was at the end of Candy's career in like 1995. And I feel like I definitely saw that like as a teenager, and I feel like by that point I was more cynical, and it was like, this does not work. I don't know if that's John Candy's fault or it's probably more Michael Moore's fault, but I mean, I don't know how I would feel revisiting it, but that isn't one that I have very fond memories of. I do love Spaceballs, which I'm sure we've talked about multiple times in our Mel Brooks episodes, but John Candy great as Mog, the half man, half dog, who's his own best friend.
Yeah, I was mistaken. It's Dan Aykroyd I was probably thinking of in Canadian Bacon, not Rick Moranis.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, both of them are Canadian though, so it's a fair thing to mix up, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, Steve Martin having quite a great third act right now with Only Murders in the Building. This season was very funny. I marked down this run he went on from here: Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, Parenthood, My Blue Heaven, LA Story, Father of the Bride. Like, can't be a bigger movie star than that, dude.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, we just mentioned LA Story in our last episode because Richard E. Grant is also in it. And I haven't seen that in a long time, but that was one of my like absolute favorites, weirdly, when I was like a kid and a teenager, more so than some of those other Steve Martin classics. And that's one that he wrote as well as starred in. And, he's been a writer, written plays, and there was a movie of his play Shop Girl with Claire Danes, which I remember quite liking as well. So it's such a multi-talented guy.
His plays are good. His book, Born Standing Up, was the impetus for me to go on my first stand-up comedy tour because I was here and I read that book in like 2 days and I was like, I got to get on the road. And that kind of created a whole college tour for me, that kind of motivation there. So I do have his new book. Number one is Walking My Life in the Movies and Other Diversions, but I haven't read it yet.
Nice. And you've seen him live in his tours with Martin Short before.
I did see him with Martin Short. I think that's worth a revisit for me. That one didn't knock me out, but I don't know. Maybe I just wasn't in the right mood that night because I can't see those two missing.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but I did see his musical performance with his bluegrass stuff that he does where he plays the banjo with the Steep Canyon Rangers, I think is the name of the band that he plays with. And I saw them at the Stagecoach Festival, which is a country music festival one year. So random to be in a tent at a country music festival and suddenly there's Steve Martin playing the banjo.
And he probably loves that. I mean, I've seen him play with them as well. They're fun.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun, definitely. So, the only other major actor, or major part in this film is Laila Robins as Neil's wife, which, as we said, was cut down a lot. And she's a busy character actor, was recently on the final season of The Walking Dead, I guess, in a main role, but has done a lot of supporting work. And, so many of those people that we mentioned, like Dylan Baker and Michael McKean and Edie McClurg, who show up in small roles just for like one moment, but really add something, all of these great comedy actors there.
Right. And Edie McClurg, who we know was also in Ferris Bueller, Larry Hankin, who was in Home Alone, and she's having a baby, right? So like he reuses a lot of these character actors effectively.
Right. Yeah. And this movie, the other legacy is just how beloved it is, even, among celebrities. I sent you guys the clip of Emma Stone on Jimmy Kimmel just from memory reciting that fuck monologue, which, is clearly something that she's, said over and over again. And so, just the amount of affection that people have for this just keeps growing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you had mentioned all these character actors. Like you could go through the list and each one of them has a storied career. So I think it just was, a great script and great casting, and we know the results.
Yeah, we do. So the result is it was an awesome movie year podcast episode, and that's what's important.
But speaking of that, this season we've done The Princess Bride, With Nail and I, and now Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which I think all three you would consider of the most quotable films ever made.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, these movies are incredibly quotable, and whatever my opinion or anyone's opinion on them, whether you like them or not, the quotability of the lines, I think, can't be denied.
And this one, like those two, whatever you think, so easy to rewatch. I think this is, there's a reason that you watch it every Thanksgiving, not just because it's a Thanksgiving movie, because it's such a fun experience.
Yeah. So that is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And that is this episode of Awesome Movie Year. You can befriend us on online and on social media.
Share some Thanksgiving love and joy with us on all the socials. AwesomeMovieYear.com, Awesome Movie Year on Facebook and Instagram, Awesome Movie Pod on... Anyway, I'm Jason Harris Comedy, or Jay Harris Comedy on all the socials. Go for Jason is the Letterboxd. And since we're talking about holidays, Josh, starting in December, will be acting in Majestic Rep's Christmas Carol for some more holiday cheer.
That is wonderful. You can find some old stuff from me at joshbellhateseverything.com and at Josh Bell Hates Everything on Facebook. I'm also at Signal Bleed on the thing that Jason didn't want to name, Twitter or X, whatever. At Signal Bleed on Blue Sky, trying to get away from Twitter or X, and at Signal Bleed on Letterboxd. And if you're on Letterboxd and review any of the movies we talk about, tag Awesome Movie Year, and we'd love to see what you think about movies that we talk about. And you can check out our producer, David Rosen's awesome podcast, Piecing It Together.
Check out Piecing It Together wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media at PiecingPod. And speaking of Thanksgiving special episodes, the same week that this goes up, Jason will be on my live episode on Eli Roth's Thanksgiving. Sure to be a Thanksgiving tradition for everybody.
I mean, I've already named about 3 other Thanksgiving movies, so this is going to be a tough one.
You think Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is going to be a puzzle piece for Thanksgiving?
I hope so.
There's got to be a few of the Thanksgiving movies that are, right? So maybe the Ice Storm.
I look forward to hearing that discussion on that episode. And Jason, what do we have in our next episode?
Josh, it's the audience choice episode, and we just threw hammers this year. It's all big, classic, iconic movies. The choices were Lethal Weapon, RoboCop, and Predator. And you guys chose RoboCop, probably because of RoboCop's appearances in World Championship Wrestling in the early 90s.
I mean, obviously, that's the reason. So tune in next time for RoboCop, and thanks for listening to Awesome Movie Year.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. Make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.